Swann. And following from this exhibition, the ABC is doing a series of films on each one of these artists. So if you'll bear with us, with this light and with the film crews, they'll be taking segments of this exhibition and this opening tonight. The second thing I'd like to explain to you is quite how we're going to operate. Now, it's not my role to be making a speech to Ron to tell you about his work, but I would like to briefly introduce what he's going to say by explaining that he was not going to talk about the works on show. What he's going to do is try and complement the paintings and the sculpture that have been selected and the article that Harry Nicholson wrote in the introduction to the catalogue, so that you'll see another aspect of his work, other paintings, other sculpture. The sculpture, we've been a bit hamstrung. We don't have a big enough area to show some of the very, very big and delightful and important works we'd like to show. But you can certainly see them in slides tonight. So may I, on behalf of you all, welcome Ron Robertson Swann to the gallery and ask him to introduce his own lecture with a talk on his art. Ron Robertson Swann.
I'm just going to come and pick up some steel. Belgiana set it up.
All right. How long will you be there?
Oh, only about a couple of hours.
Okay.
It's only possible for me to work as a sculptor, more or less from the offcuts of an industrialized society. And the big steel mills and Transfield are it's a bit like feeding off a whale. They're the industrial concerns that allows me to get access to the sort of materials that I use in my sculpture. And that's what's essential to me. They also stimulate me in lots of respects. You see things there that not exactly give you ideas, but show you possibilities.
I want a painting, and a piece of sculpture for that matter, to be something that only painting and sculpture can do. Different, a totally different experience. Not people usually enjoy art, certain sorts of art, where the art is only a trigger for some memory for them. A landscape that reminded me of the time when I was in the country. It was very beautiful, and the painting acts as a trigger for an experience. I would always want my work to be the experience itself. And it's because I want it to be an experience in itself. It will be an unfamiliar experience. And people that shy away from that, because they really only want to be reassured generally about their own experiences. They don't necessarily want to be confronted with a new one. It makes them uncomfortable. You've got to change to accommodate it. And I find that exciting. A lot of people find it unpleasant, slightly unpleasant. That's the main reason for being or wanting to be an abstract artist and not a figurative or landscape artist. I think that a lot of my things will inevitably have association. It's hard for them not to have association because all things in the world are not that new that they can be so way out. But I want to minimize that, not play on it. A lot of artists play on it. Not that they don't produce good art when they do it, but that's just not what I'm interested in.
Metal is an amazing material. The steel has tremendous tensile strength, and yet it's one of the most malleable materials as well. You can bend it, you can roll it, you can brake press it, you can cut it, doesn't matter what thickness. You can beat it like a blacksmith. So while it has this incredible tensile strength, it also has a fluidity about it that few other materials have. When most people come across steel, they just see it as an absolutely intangible, hard stuff that they don't know what the hell to do with. So it often encourages me to be adventurous with my materials.
Well, the main trouble with sculpture, I think, is that a lot of battles have been won for painting, for modern painting, but people still don't look at sculpture as art. It's always something else. For architects, it's monstrous costume jewelry. It's garden furniture for ladies in the eastern suburbs. It's play sculpture. It's anything but really having some dialogue with the artist's intention. Sculptors are partly responsible for that too, because they've fallen for it in the same way that the public have. Architects in particular don't understand it as art, but as they're always wanting it to do something. For instance, an architect asked me if I could do a piece of sculpture for a site, and I had thought that he'd known something about what my sculpture was about, and he asked me if I could do a vertical one. That would fill the space nicely, and it would set against the wall. And the whole essence of my sculpture to this point is that it's mostly horizontal, not as a stylistic device, but the moment you take a piece of sculpture off a base and you want the thing to have a logical progression of how it stands, it's got to develop from the ground without the device of a base or legs. They're the same thing. People have mistaken a lot of modernist art because it's got 3 legs instead of 2. But that's still like a tripod. The traditional idea of something with a core is that it's vertical. And you have, it doesn't matter what device, if you use a tripod of 2 legs or 3 legs in the sculpture, somehow here, that's the same equivalent as putting it on a pedestal or a base. The other sort of sculpture has got to have a different logic. It's a more physical and immediate thing. It might be stacking. How you would stack something. Maybe you could have something leaning here. The thing has to be physical in its own way, and not just accepting a device, a base as a given thing, as something declaring it as art. So it's not just a stylistic device, it's a whole intent, and it's much easier to get up to this sort of height here using those devices when you use a different logic
The sculpture tends to be more natural. Also, there's a personal concern of having a sense that gravity plays a role in the real world. There are some fundamental differences in approaching modern sculpture. I've been working on something here, which I'll reconstruct for you. I've just been playing around with this. This has to be cut off here because this centralizes the composition, if you like, and stops the flow of the sculpture. It looks like a central point, and the other parts would then tend to read as appendages to a central point, which is a little bit more like traditional sculpture. The idea is that there is an axis along which it moves, along the ground. Traditional sculpture has been something that has had a core, a vertical core, and you confront it as a statue, usually on a base and something, and a statue or something of the sensation of an altarpiece. Modernist sculpture occupies the same floor space that we do, that human beings do. So it doesn't declare itself so easily as art, but imposing in another way in that it occupies and lives in the same space we do, so we can confront it like a common object, as it were. It also tends to have, for me anyway, and at this particular moment, something of a cause and effect of the parts leaning or tilting or resting against each other. The way in which natural objects would lean or tilt or rest. I usually play around with it like this for some time until I decide exactly. I get used to the idea of looking at it before I begin to weld it up. Being a sculptor and a painter is a slightly sore point. I've never quite figured out what it is. I'm not really meant to do both. Somehow I'm not allowed to do both. And if I do both, then I've got to be no good at one or the other, because there's a shortage of sculptors. And because a lot of my basic training was as a sculptor, somehow I'm not meant to be a painter. I'm certainly not meant to be a good painter. It's upset the balance of things in tiny minds. For me, they complement each other. They don't necessarily feed off each other, but they complement each other. In the early 60s, at St. Martin's, we had high hopes for the possibilities of color in sculpture. And finally, those possibilities were exhausted to some extent, and they didn't bear the sort of fruit that we hoped they would. Because I think what's essential with color is that it works on surface and as surface. And the most successful sculptures one could make with color was the flattest sort of sculpture. So it functioned more as a painting. And the things with my sculpture, I wanted it to be more like sculpture, more living in a three-dimensional world. So color, or its possibilities, became restricting. But color itself is magic, and to actually be able to go out of the sculpture studio when you've exhausted that and start pouring paint, it's a bit like liquid steel. You can pour a great big bucket full of red up one end of the canvas, and it's in there in space. It's holding itself up. You can't do that at sculpture. You've got to have a scaffolding, a crane, and it becomes a nightmare. They're just very different qualities, and I enjoy doing both. Color is essential to me because I get all the excitement of form, pure form, in the sculpture. So I look to the release in painting of letting color spread and work by itself rather than having to form and shape and place things as I do in sculpture. The device that I'm using at the moment is that I tend to pour and spill and splatter paint on wet canvas so that my mark is not left. The paint itself does its own moving. It looks organic or natural. Natural in the sense that there is no brush stroke, no artist's wrist at work in the painting, nothing identifiable. It's almost as if somebody put a culture
in a special, a germ in a special culture, and looked at it through a magnifying glass next morning, it will have spread and taken on its own shape. And the device I'm using at the moment is like that. I want it to look as if it, I want it to look as if the painting grew like that overnight. Each time you face a sculpture, you face new problems and new possibilities. And by doing that, you do tend to get, bored is not the right word, but you can get excited about something new happening. I don't know how you'd explain the feeling I have. Sometimes when I'm unsure of what I'm doing, I feel a little timid, and then the steel becomes intangible to me too, and shifting it around and moving it into place and setting it up to cut it or weld it is sometimes, by yourself in the studio, sometimes quite a task. And you gotta feel a bit spunky to throw yourself into it. And if you're feeling a bit depressed or a little fragile, you know, then it becomes a terrible barrier. I have some affinity with the steel workers, but not very much. Handling the same material, so there's a certain attitude. I don't know what that attitude is. The affinity I feel with them is limited, and it only relates to the fact that we're using the same material. The ends are totally different. I think they would view me as being really quite crazy. And the thing is that it's to art ends. It may well be the affinity of a house painter to a painter. I'm sure they understand the liquidity of paint, how to use it, what surfaces, you know, in the same way that steel workers understand welds, joints, fluidity of steel too. Not much more than that. I mean, if you can get too romantic about that identification and get lost in schmaltz and the love of material,
I don't love steel in the way that one could imagine sculptors loving marble or wood. It's an extraordinary material which gives me the greatest freedom, and that's really what's essentially important. The others is an oblique stimulus. It has tensile strength more than most materials, and when you get used to handling it, it's more malleable than most materials as well. It can be cut, bent, rolled, heated, forged, anything you like. And whatever form it ends up in, it still retains its tensile strength. The freedom for that in sculpture is that you can literally have an enormous block of steel, and out of one corner, you're going to have a tiny little bit of wire brazed to the end. And there's no other material that allows you that sort of latitude. And that's the freedom that it gives me to do what I want to do in sculpture. There is a restriction. All materials have certain restrictions, and I sometimes even enjoy working within those restrictions. The way in which it's used in industry as well, the offcuts, if you like, often give you ideas, give you shapes that you may not necessarily invent. So it broadens the spectrum of possibilities. I mean, picking up shapes, learning to live with them, familiarizing yourself with them, sometimes they just fit in. And if it was all just raw material, just straight plate, and you had to cut out every shape, you restrict inventiveness in a way. The inventiveness of discovery rather than inventing it right from scratch. Like an extended palette. There are so many colors. There's only so many colors in the world. You can get a multiplicity of those colors by the mixing of it. It's like finding mixed colors that you could never imagine mixing. You know, that's the way in which it extends your palette, by finding these different offcuts of steel.